2 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 16, Paul writes, "Therefore we do not lose heart, even though our outward man is perishing, yet the inward man is being renewed day by day." He says, "For we do not lose heart." He says, even though our outward man is perishing, no matter what we're going through, he says, our inward man is being renewed day by day. Friends, that is the Christian's hope. He says in verse 17, and I want you to keep in mind the affliction and the trials, the temptations. Of course, we go through trials and temptations as well, but the persecution that the first century church was going through. And with those things in mind, Paul says, for our light affliction, which is but for a moment, for our light affliction, which is but for a moment, is working for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. He says the affliction, the persecution that we're going through, he says that's light, and it's not going to last forever. He says in verse 18, as we do not look for the things which are seen, but to the things which are unseen. He says we're not looking for things that we can physically see. He says for the things which are seen are temporary. They'll pass away. He says, but the things that are unseen are eternal. That's why in 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 7 he says, for we walk by faith, not by sight. In other words, a Christian should be focused on spiritual things, not only what we can see with our own eyes. Why? Because those things will pass away. He says in chapter 5 and verse 1, for we know that if our earthly house, our body, this tent, is destroyed, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. He says, even if I should die, Paul writes, even if I should die, he says, I'm not going to worry about that. Why? Because I have a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. And again, I'll say that's why in verse 7 he says, for we walk by faith, not by sight. Now in the closing of his thought in verse 8 he says, we are confident. We are confident. As Christians, friends, we should be confident. He says, well pleased rather to be absent from the body and be present with the Lord. In Galatians chapter 6 and verse 9, Paul writes, and let us not grow weary while doing good, for in due season we shall reap if we do not lose heart. Well, what shall we reap? A home in heaven, our reward for not growing weary as we live the Christian life. That's why in 2 Corinthians chapter 4 he says we do not grow weary. He talks about the fleshly body, it might be destroyed. He says, but our inward man is renewed day by day. He says again in Galatians chapter 6 and verse 9, and let us not grow weary while doing good. Now Romans chapter 8 and verse 24 explains verse 18 of 2 Corinthians chapter 4. It talks a lot about what is unseen and what is seen, this, that, and the other. Romans chapter 8 and verse 24, he says, for we are saved in this hope. We are saved in this hope, but what hope that is seen is not hope. He says, but what hope that is seen is not hope, for why does one still hope for what he sees? He says, I understand that hope is based on something that you have not seen. Paul says that's the whole point. That's why in Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 1 it says that faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things unseen. Again, Hebrews chapter 11 verse 1, it says, now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Dear friend, let us not grow weary while doing good. Let us walk by faith and not by sight.